welcome back to my channel. My name is Aika. This YouTube channel is focused on increasing access to psychology and mental health, and also to document my journey through the Doctorate of Clinical Psychology. So today I am coming back with another video, which is the differences between a PhD and a DClinPsy. Now, the reason why I wanted to make this video is because it happens a lot where people kind of conflate the two degrees together, and the amount of times that people have congratulated me on getting onto a PhD course is surprisingly high. And it's also really important, I guess, for people who are studying psychology right now and considering maybe what kind of graduate degrees or I guess career routes they want to take, if they want to continue further study, what the main differences between a DClinPsy and PhD is. So just as a disclaimer, I am not a doctor of anything right now. I'm just Aika. So I've neither started in DClinPsy or ever done a PhD before. What the information I have is of my own personal research and also my own experience of going through the DClinPsy journey, and also through, being offered PhDs before and kind of exploring that route as well. So most of the information hopefully will be helpful. All of my videos are kind of, subjective opinions, so just take it with a pinch of salt and do your own research as well. So I've kind of thought about the main differences between a PhD and DClinPsy that people should be considering if they're considering both routes, or the main things that distinguish a PhD career and a DClinPsy career. I've basically categorized it into certain things like cost, duration, entry requirements, even like type of person, job prospects, cost, all of these things, which will be hopefully linked down below as timestamps so you can skip ahead if you're interested in specific topics. It will be done in good time, but usually I procrastinate on the timestamp for like a day or something like that. Just to start off with the overarching main similarities and differences between the DClinPsy and the PhD before we get into the nitty-gritties of it. So both the DClinPsy and the PhD, you come out with a doctor in front of your name, which is fabulous. But the PhD is a Doctorate of Philosophy, and the DClinPsy is a Doctorate of Clinical Psychology. So as the name suggests, Doctor of Philosophy can be very broad, so you can do it in clinical psychology or any type of psychology out there, or even not psychology, you can do it in environmental sciences or something, whereas the DClinPsy is very specific to clinical psychology. So that's already a really big difference there. Another big difference is that the DClinPsy is a practitioner doctorate, so it means that when you qualify, you become a clinical psychologist and you practice, or you're able to practice on a clinical level, to see patients on an individual basis and to be able to assess and treat and all that jazz. Whereas in a PhD, you can come out with a PhD in clinical psychology and be an absolute expert in, clinical disorders, more than someone with a practitioner doctorate will ever be. But you're probably definitely not allowed to practice as a clinical psychologist. You will probably have to then do a practitioner doctorate if you want to do that. And in a PhD, most of your time is spent affiliated with a research institution or an academic institution, and a lot of the focus is conducting research. And that can be clinical as well, but you wouldn't be practicing, if that makes sense. So the next section is the type of person that would be interested or more involved in DClinPsy, or type of person that would be like more like a PhD student. So let's just start with DClinPsy trainee, so clinical doctorate trainee. So DClinPsy trainees, a typical kind of look of someone, if there even is a look, is that, obviously they will have had definite clinical experience in a clinical setting, so working directly with people. So they've literally, because of the requirement, they would have worked at least 1 year in a clinical setting before they started their DClinPsy degree. However, the average is around 3.3 years of kind of clinical and research experience. They will have more of a focus on interest in working directly with people possibly, but not necessarily. And they will have both clinical and research experience, because the DClinPsy is 50-50, well, usually 50-50 split of research and clinical focus. Clinical experience, some research experience, interest in working with people directly in theory, but not necessarily, because some DClinPsy students do come out and want to continue with research, and that's also a route, but it's, I think, a little bit rarer for people to do that. How a PhD student looks like. So PhD student definitely have to be quite strong on the research side of things, so good with stats, good with research, possibly involvement, well, not possibly, but definitely some involvement with research beforehand, because, you know, it's very, very rigorous as well to get into a PhD. A person that's doing a PhD might be more interested in one very specific topic, or wanting to specialize in research and becoming an expert in a very specific question, and their focus would be more interested in research, a little bit more arm's length than direct clinical contact, though that is a generalization. PhD student doesn't necessarily have to have had any clinical experience. They're probably, you know, more focused and more interested in the research side. The next section is duration. So the DClinPsy and the PhD, they're both generally 3 years in the UK. However, there are some nuances where, for example, in the DClinPsy, it does say on the some courses 3 to 4 years, and also sometimes if you want to further specialize into neuropsychology and become a neuropsychologist or a neuroclinical psychologist, fancy, you usually do a year on top of that, and you can also do further training in more specifically in specific therapeutic approaches like CBT, which is again another year. Whereas a PhD is also generally 3 years, but again, there is a possibility to extend to 4 years if you have extra funding, or it can go up to 5 to 6 years if you're doing it part-time, or there are a lot of circumstances that mean that PhDs are usually longer, but most people tend to aim for 3 years, and that's usually where the funding goes to. You can also usually have a kind of, you get into a PhD, but it's a 1+3 year, which means that you do a master's beforehand and then you do the PhD afterwards. Next section is cost. So in the DClinPsy, you are fully funded. So that means that the NHS commissions trainee spots for 3 years and you get paid a full salary. You are paid on a band 6 level, with London weighting if you're a part of London universities, because London's a high cost area. If you're self-funded, which is a minute proportion of DClinPsy students, maybe like 10 to 20%, but I'm not really sure what the number is, then you have to fund yourself and you have to pay for the course basically. And that really depends. If you're an international student, you have to pay normal international fees to do the 3 years. If you are a home status student, then you again pay like a typical kind of like 9 grand to 10 grand self-funded spot for the DClinPsy for 3 years. But that's a small, very, very small proportion of DClinPsy spaces. On the other hand, the PhD, you have a stipend, and you also then fight for some research grants. So you fight with your supervisor to, I guess, sell your project and get some grants for that. You can also be self-funded as well. So there are many self-funded PhDs, but there's also funded PhDs as well. With the PhD, there's no tax because you are still a student. Because I've been offered PhDs before, or also considered the PhD route, and also obviously had a look at the pay in clinical psychology, the differences are huge. So not huge, but you know, it's evident. So for the Doctorate of Clinical Psychology, you are paid at a band 6 level. That is around 30-something thousand, 36,000 if you are in London. And for PhDs, it can go down to 15,000 to 16,000. So there are very few that are more than that, but from my experience looking at multiple PhDs that's been advertised, obviously with 16,000 with no tax, it might mean that, you know, it's actually livable, whereas like 30-something thousand, it's with tax as well. But that's definitely something to consider. In terms of the application process, it's also very different. So the DClinPsy is led by Leeds Clearinghouse, which for those who are aspiring clinical psychologists, I'm sorry for our trigger word, the clearinghouse, but everything goes through the clearinghouse. It kind of feels like a little bit like UCAS, where you like kind of put in 4 of your top choices and you write one application for all of them. The application process starts in around October time, which is coming soon. You write the application, then you have some screening tests for some universities, and then you get like an interview. Maybe some even have group interviews as well. So that's the application process. And then for PhDs, it's a little bit different. The PhDs, you usually get in contact with a supervisor or the supervisor who has advertised that PhD post, and then you discuss and negotiate what kind of project or what kind of research interest you have, and then you, I guess, make a proposal of a project. Or sometimes with more competitive ones, you generate the project first, and then you kind of not advertise, but you kind of try to convince that person that, you know, you should be taken on, and that might be based on your previous research output or involvement, or yeah, whatever. And then you have like different kind of panel interviews based on like funding grants and things like that. As you can tell, it's a lot more hazy when I describe PhDs compared to DClinPsy, simply because, you know, I went further with DClinPsy than with PhD stuff. But from my experience of nearly becoming a PhD student, it was a lot of supervisor likes how you know, look on paper and how you performed, or like, yeah, how you performed over a year. They're impressed by, you know, your potential, and they want to take you on, and then you guys like negotiate something out of that. And it can be very broad or it can be very specific. So for example, if it's like a research team on dementia and they want a dementia PhD student, it would probably be maybe even a project that they've already been working on, and they want someone who has dementia interest or research experience to do a dementia PhD. But there are also exceptions where you work as a supervisor and just figure out what kind of things you want to do when you're doing that, so you can be involved in multiple projects as well. In terms of the requirement for the application, would probably require you to have at least a 2-1 in undergraduate level. For DClinPsy, stricter of like upper 2-1, so 65% or above, which anyone from the US or anywhere else, that's like quite high in the UK to get 65 or above. For PhDs, it's probably similar, also upper 2-1. I think it's more lenient around what degree you do. So in the DClinPsy, it's very specific to, you have to have a BPS accredited psychology degree. Whereas for clinical psychology PhDs, you might come from multiple different angles. You might have done a social sciences degree, you might have done a history degree, you might have done a philosophy degree as your first degree, and then have decided to go into a psychology or clinical psychology PhD. So I think it's less stringent in the PhD arena. It's usually they advertise psychology or any other relevant social sciences degree. So however you'd like to interpret that. Right, so in terms of the focus of the actual 3 years, so how it kind of looks like, obviously I know a little bit more of the DClinPsy route, but I also have friends doing the PhD route as well. So in the DClinPsy, it's very specific. You usually have 5 to 6 placements that are 6 months long in various populations, or like various services with different populations. So there are very specific competencies that you have to pass. So working with older adults, working with children and adolescents, learning disabilities, something like that. You have to be able to have worked with multiple populations basically by the end of the doctorate course. So it sounds very versatile, but it's also very stringent in terms of the specific competencies that you're expected to do. You're also expected to generate a final thesis, and also throughout some little projects or case studies written up. It really depends on the course, how it kind of works. And you're also taught management skills. I think the end of the 3 years, the focus is more on how to like go up higher in the NHS ladder. Whereas in a PhD, a lot of people think that it's a very like specific thing, like you have to know exactly what you want to do, and you know, within the first year or within when you apply already. Whilst that is true for many people who have research interest, because you know they already have very specific questions that they want to answer, a lot of times actually the question kind of molds itself whilst you're working towards it. So actually it's quite versatile when you actually enter, and then you probably get lectures or look at different kind of labs or talk to different kinds of people to see like what kind of things that you can do. And it's also more versatile than most people think, because actually you work on sometimes multiple projects at once. You would be signing up to knowing that you're conducting research in a specific field, but in terms of the question, a lot of times it's molded over time. So destinations, I've already touched on this a little bit. Both PhD and DClinPsy get to call themselves doctors. I don't know how many people who actually do this, but you know, you can do it legally. PhD students, once they graduate, they can put PhD at the end of the name and doctor at the start of the name. Whatever floats people's boats. And then what you do afterwards, you usually want to apply for a postdoc position where you continue to conduct research in the field that you've ended up specializing in, and maybe you work in a team, become a research associate, and then you can also work towards kind of part-time lecturing or proper lecturing or even professorship, which is like very rare for anyone nowadays. So you probably always will end up linked to an academic institution. If not, then a research institution. Some of them even end up going out of academia and working in like startups. Destinations for DClinPsys, most of them become clinical psychologists and practice in a specific service. So you end up choosing some specialization in something. So maybe like I'll end up loving learning disabilities or something, and I'll qualify and then work in a learning disability service. Other destinations that people go into, some people apply for funding to continue doing research. Maybe they really enjoyed the research component of the DClinPsy and they want to kind of go into more like academic clinical psychology. I think from what I've read online, it's a bit harder for DClinPsys to work in an academic setting because you're competing against other PhD students. However, it is possible. Clinical psychologists, they're expected to work in the NHS especially if you were funded by the NHS to do the doctorate course in the first place. However, some people do go into private work. At least, you know, when I went to a talk, some clinical psychologists told us that, like, yeah, people are doing more and more private stuff nowadays. So the last section is basically exploring the challenges, or like the pros and cons of doing a PhD over a DClinPsy and a DClinPsy over a PhD. So in comparison to each other. Okay, so challenges of the DClinPsy. So I'm going to link a video on I'm the biggest fan of PsychAssist, who was the OG clinical psychology YouTuber. Well, he's a health psychologist, well, trainee now, but yeah, he made a lot of videos on it. So I'm going to link a video on his experience doing a health psychology doctorate down below and the realities of it, and that probably covers most of the challenges that people actually face when they get onto the doctorate. So the main challenges that I probably personally foresee is that there's very stringent criteria and competencies that you have to meet. So there's a lot less flexibility than it would have in a PhD, where things can be negotiated, I guess. You can negotiate your placements maybe, but in terms of number of placements and the type of placements, there are very specific things that you have to hit. And also in terms of the types of, I guess, case studies or reports and things like that, there's also very specific assignments. So it means that there's very small leeway for doing your own thing in DClinPsy. It's very already structured in itself already. So taking time off is, you can't take more than a few days off, because you have like 2 teaching days that are mandatory each week until like who knows how long. So the main challenge that I see for PhDs is the competitiveness after getting the PhD. So it's, you know, there's a gazillion psychology PhDs out there, so you have to have like generated a lot of research output during your PhD. And, you know, the politics of publishing is actually, you know, quite difficult. So, and a lot of people struggle getting postdoc positions or researcher positions, and, you know, we're not even talking about lectureship and professorship. You can get stuck at a postdoc position for like 5 years, or stuck in temporary lecturing for a really long time. Yes, another challenge for PhD is that you have to be very self-disciplined, because unlike the DClinPsy, most supervisors just let you run your own course. So if you don't structure your day properly, then it can, you know, the PhD can easily fly by. So finally, in terms of the benefits between the PhD and the DClinPsy. PhD, as I said, you can make time a lot easier for, you know, your side projects, maybe like a tutoring company, or projects like collaborating with startups. There's a lot more flexibility of like how you can kind of shape your PhD to like what you want to kind of do. Yeah, and you can kind of collaborate with other people across the world, and it can be very, very exciting to have 3 years to kind of like play around with what kind of way you want to engage in research. Another one of the main benefits of PhD compared to DClinPsy is that PhD degrees are more widely recognized across the world compared to DClinPsy, which is like, I think it only exists in the UK. America has a different name for it. There's PsyDs, and then there's also their PhDs, but like their PhDs also, you can be a clinical psychologist. So anyways, as you can tell, it's a confusing mess to convert your DClinPsy degree that's based in the UK to like other countries. Benefits of being a DClinPsy graduate, so becoming a clinical psychologist basically. Psychologists are very high in demand, which is great. The issue is actually getting into the DClinPsy. That's difficult. So obviously that's one of the main challenges, is actually getting into the DClinPsy. So I should have actually said that as the main challenge. But yeah, getting into the DClinPsy is very, 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 very difficult. But once you get out on the other end, it seems like there's always jobs around for clinical psychologists. And I say this not out of like subjectively reading job adverts and stuff like that. Actually, this year they've actually managed to fight for 25% extra funded spaces for trainee clinical psychologists. And I think that is the perfect illustration of how in high demand clinical psychologists are. So we come to the end of the video now. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any further comments or questions, please feel free to drop them in the comment section below. I would like to end to say that, you know, either way, both PhDs and DClinPsy, they have such a huge impact on people's lives, but just on different kinds of levels. And I see equal value in both of them, and it really depends on your personal interests and also strengths, which one you end up choosing. And also to say that they're not mutually exclusive. A lot of people have PhDs and then go become a practitioner and, you know, train as a clinical psychologist afterwards. And then there's also clinical psychologists who want to do a PhD to further their interest in a specific research field as well. So hopefully this has been helpful, and I'll see you next week. Bye.